Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Beverly, and I am so sorry that I could not be with you today in person. I had looked forward to this for weeks and had really prepared, and I'd hoped that we could have a wonderful dialogue. Unfortunately, we received the word late last week of a family member that I was close to that had passed away in Gainesville, Florida. And 2 years ago, when he was diagnosed with a terminal illness, he asked if I would promise to do his eulogy at his funeral. And so I ask your prayers as you are seeing this. I'm probably on the last part of the leg toward Gainesville and a funeral that will be tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. So thank you so much for your patience in me not being there personally, but I hope I can come back and we can have at some point in the future a one-on-one dialogue on this very important subject. But I told Regina, I said, I'll be glad to go into the studio and have what I hope is not considered to be a presentation, but is a one-on-one conversation, as if I'm talking to you as if you're one person. Because that's the way it is in dealing with a subject that it's not as bad as it used to be, but still one that a lot of people don't want to talk about. And it's the one that many people say it's an illness that people suffer in silence with every day. And that is still true, and that is depression. I have depression. Now, I say that openly. It's easy to say, and it would be easy for me to say, I had depression or I have had depression. But technically, it's something I have to manage every day. I still take a small saccharin-sized tablet every day that helps regulate my nervous system, neurotransmitters, and the things that can oftentimes, without treatment, create depression. And so I continue to have treatment for that every day, and I'm living a rich, full, and happy life. But I can also tell you that at its lowest point, depression can be the proverbial living hell, because it's like trying to climb up Mount Everest and you're not sure that you're ever going to reach the top and scale it. I wanted to share something with you, and this is what I would have done if I'd been there in person, to share with you some things about my own story with this. I'm not here to instruct you from a clinical standpoint because I'm not a doctor. And one of the things that I have to be very careful with is that when I have, over these last 4 years in particular, spoken out in public about my bout with depression, my multiple bouts, 3 of them to be exact. When I've spoken out about this, I'll have people who approach me will say, well, I've got a family member, or I've got a son, or I've got a cousin who has depression, or they're dealing with it, and they're just not getting anywhere with it. Would you talk to them? And without sounding like I'm trying to dodge the issue, the truth is, I usually will say, listen, the best thing I can do is refer them to a qualified and competent professional, because I'm not a professional. And as one of my friends who is a psychologist told me, that they said, frankly, you almost skirt the edge that you could get sued if you sit down and try to counsel with someone, or if they have the impression that that's what you're doing, try to counsel with someone who then they don't suddenly get the solution they want. You could end up being in some real trouble about that. And so I always try to tell everybody I will be glad to refer you or suggest a competent professional. But I'm not the one who does the counseling. I've had to have it myself. So I hope everybody understands that we're on a level playing field where that's concerned. I speak out about this because a lot of you have been accustomed to seeing me on television for nearly 30 years in this community, from when I came here in 1990. And most of the time you see an upbeat, energetic, happy person. And if you watch my Saturday or Sunday night TV classic show that I love so much because it brings back so many great memories for people, you see a guy that probably a lot of you would say, oh, there's no way he ever has a bad day. Oh, boy. If you only knew. Yes, I have depression that has been managed off and on for the past 28 years. My first connection with depression came in 1971 when my father, one of the most respected ministers, yes, a pastor, in South Georgia, suddenly, after 3 years with a difficult and conflicted congregation, after having many, many successful years in the pastorate, he was diagnosed as having a chemical imbalance in his blood, and the circumstances created the perfect storm, and he was diagnosed with clinical depression. Now, let me tell you, in 1971, my mother and I knew nothing about this. We didn't know what it was. We didn't understand it. We just knew something was wrong with Daddy. He would come in at night, and this is a man who has been so responsible for so many people increasing and developing in their Christian faith. But he would come in at night and he would hit the couch after he came back from the office. I'm not sure how he stayed in the office for that long. And he would come in, and some nights he would eat supper, sometimes he would not, but he'd just want to sleep all the time. Or we would see him go into crying spells, and we didn't know what was going on, but we knew something was wrong. And finally, after a few months, he agreed that something was wrong. And he was referred to a wonderful doctor in Augusta, Georgia, Dr. Neville Thigpen, who had written a book called The Three Faces of Eve. It's still a legendary book, and a movie was made out of it, about a person whose mental illness was to the degree that they really went into multiple personalities. And Dr. Thigpen had he was ahead of his time in dealing with mental illness at all levels. He was the first person likely who said that mental illness is not one size fits all. But after examining Daddy and dealing with so many other people who had had experiences like him, he said that my father had clinical depression that was in part because of a chemical imbalance in the blood and because of a professional situation that had become almost untenable. He couldn't go back and take a church for 6 years. He did do some interim pastorships where he didn't have to deal with the administration. But it was 6 years before he was cleared to do a full-time pastorate again. And he did. He had wonderful years back in the ministry that he loved so much. But Daddy had to deal with enormous stigma. You're talking about nearly 50 years ago. The stigma was horrible about mental illness. And even fellow pastors shied away from him. There were some who, even a couple of his closest friends were among those who said, well, you know, F.J. Beverly, he went crazy. Yep, they really said it. And that's another thing that's a hard part about the road back, is that there are a lot of people who will say things about mental illness, even though we've come a long way in the last 50 years to eliminating stigma. We haven't stomped it out altogether. And I have to be candid with you. There are people who continue to say things out of total ignorance. Among them, those who say, and there are ministers who will say this today, that, oh, you don't have a physical problem, you don't have an emotional problem, you have a faith problem. You just need to pray harder, or you just need to have more faith and you won't be depressed. I wonder if those same people would say that to someone who had just been diagnosed with cancer. Would they say that to someone with pneumonia? Would they say that to someone with a debilitating disease that wasn't terminal but would take an extensive amount of treatment to overcome? Would you say that you just have to have more faith and you'll be completely well? Depression is a time-consuming job from which to recover, but you can do it. I'm living proof of it. I've been through 3 bouts myself. I moved here in 1990 as news director and later operations manager of WBBJ. I was in that job for 3 years. But when I was hired, I came here and I saw an operation that looked like it was about one clapboard away from a collapse. Thankfully, things have improved greatly in that organization from when I came here. I convinced myself after coming for the interview and looking at a sample of the 6 o'clock news on the evening we were here to interview that there was no way you could mess up a situation like that. And so I told my wife, I said, I think I want to take it. I was never one to try to run from a challenge. So I agreed to come, and there were many things during that first year that created a perfect storm. I'm not going to go into all of them because they would divert from our real purpose, and that's to talk about depression and how to heal from it. First off, depression often is brought on by physical exhaustion. At least that is one catalyst for it. And for me, that's been the case in all 3 bouts that I had in 1991, in 2010, and in 2014. All 3 bouts. The big catalyst was physical exhaustion. I was misled about a number of things, and I began to put a guilt trip on myself about it by not asking more direct questions when I accepted the job here in 1990. And so I went into a period where I was kicking myself in the backside about why I even came here. And one of the things I was misled about was the number of people I had to cover 14 counties that expected us to cover news in their area. And what happened is I realized that we were 3 people shorter than what I was told we were going to have. And one of the mistakes I made is to employ what psychologists later told me was the Superman complex, in that I tried to make up the difference of 2 or 3 people that I didn't have on the staff. So as well as being the administrator, I tried to get out on the street and report, as well as do commentaries. I tried to do things that would perhaps help our deficits. And one of the problems also sometimes for people with depression, it really hits hard at times with type A people who have been used to being in successful situations. That had been me. I'd had a very positive schooling and education. I made excellent grades. I was a Phi Beta Kappa in college. And throughout my career in television news, I had seen very good success. I'd had opportunities in Columbus, Georgia, in Wilmington, North Carolina, and in Spartanburg, South Carolina, to work for organizations that provided the resources that made it possible for somebody to do a decent job. That wasn't the case here. And there were a lot of other reasons for that occurring. And so eventually what happened is one night after 1 year, and for about 6 weeks before I finally had a nervous breakdown, for about 6 weeks, I knew something wasn't right. I was so dreadfully tired all the time. And at that time, I'm only 35 years old. I was so dreadfully tired. And I would come in the house, and it was almost like deja vu of what would be happening with my father. The minute I would come in the house, I would hit the recliner and just want to be out of it. And we'd have supper, but I wanted to go back to sleep again because I was just completely exhausted. And that's not like me because I love to stay up. But the bottom line to it is something wasn't right. And finally one night in the summer of 1991, I walked into my house, I dropped to my knees, and I had a nervous breakdown. I had a crying spell that went on for 90 minutes until my wife finally got me in the shower. And if there's anybody who is a saint, it is Rebecca Beverly. She knew what my father's situation was, and she knew that it was a possibility that depression was hereditary because of it being a chemical imbalance in the blood. And she was very patient. And she was also very, very upset at the situation that allowed this to happen. And she got on the phone and let's just say this. She had some friendly conversations with a couple of people, and I was proud of her for that. But then what happened is that she got me an appointment the next morning with our family doctor, who immediately referred me to one of this community's most wonderful psychiatrists. And was I embarrassed about going? No, because I wanted to get well. And I'd seen what happened with my father. So I understood this was not something that I was going to be able to heal myself with. And he went over with me very thoroughly. He said, this is not going to be a case of taking a couple of tablets and calling me in a couple of days and you're going to be fine. This is probably going to take weeks, maybe even months, for you to feel like you again, because it didn't happen in just a few days that you went into this. And he said, yes, you have depression. And we had to experiment with medication to see what would work and what would not work. And he said, one of the things you're going to have to learn is patience, because of the fact that most people, if you get an illness, and particularly at your age, you feel like that if it's the flu, okay, 8 or 9 days, I'm going to be okay. If you get a sinus infection, yeah, you'll work through it, but you'll get well pretty soon. Not so in this case. You got to take it day by day, sometimes hour by hour. I finally did get well, but it took about 6 months before Steve was Steve again. And I ultimately got out of that job because the environment and the situation continued to be a semi-trigger for me just not feeling as though I was totally well, totally whole. So after 3 years, I transitioned to what I felt like was a great calling, and that is to go into teaching at Union University. Now, to develop the program that we have over the past 27 years, it didn't just happen in just a few short weeks. And I worked very hard, and we had to build up resources, and that was something that took time. But if you've had depression, learning patience helps you build patience in other areas. One of my longtime dreams and goals was to develop a daily newscast for students to have a replicating experience of what they would face if they're out there working permanently. And in 2008, on Jackson Energy Authority's E+ TV6, we began Jackson 24/7 as a daily noon newscast. Some people thought I was nuts to try to do something like this every day, but I wanted these students to have an experience that could be similar and get them a leg up on getting a job in the field that they wanted, where they wanted to practice. And the one thing that I miscounted, we did Jackson 24/7 for 10 years until the money was cut off by JEA. But we did that broadcast for 10 years, and we had very good success, nearly 2,300 broadcasts. But one thing that I discounted was that I have these students 4 hours a day, 4 hours a week, not 40 hours a week. And so consequently, Steve went back into the old mode of trying to do too much himself. And for about a month in 2010, I began to feel sort of like I did back in 1991. But I kept thinking, I'm going to be over it. It's going to finally ease off. Well, it didn't. And finally, one day in March of 2010, Dr. Joanne Stevenson, one of the greatest people I know, pulled me off the set after she did the final segment of that day's Jackson 24/7, and she said, "This is an intervention." And I wasn't sure what she meant, but I knew she meant business. You don't argue with Dr. Joe. And she said, "You are in depression. And if we don't do something about this, you are going to be dead by Christmas." When anybody, but particularly Dr. Joe, tells you you're going to be dead by Christmas, if that's not a wake-up call, then you're dumb. And I sat up and took notice. I was in depression once again, and I was physically exhausted. And the two came together for yet another perfect storm. And it took, I worked through it. I don't know how I did. And somehow I masked that from my students. I worked so hard, in fact, to masquerade that I was having depression, that my students didn't know it, but when I got home, I was totally drained because I had been working so hard during the day emotionally to try to keep the students from knowing it. Thank goodness we were only 2 months away from that most important summer break. But it took 4 to 6 months before Steve felt like Steve again. And then in 2014, my third bout. And that was about 6 months after my father passed away. I spent virtually the entire summer of 2013 in Waycross, Georgia, after my father broke his hip, and then we saw the ravages of Parkinson's take over. My wife came back in 14 times over a 6-month period trying to give me some relief. My mother had become a fall risk at that point in time. Both of them were in their 80s, and it reached a point where they had to have help. But as all of you know, that if you have been or you know someone who is a caregiver, it takes an enormous amount out of you. And I came back to Jackson with only 2 days to transition back into the academic world for the fall of 2014. And I was drained. I was exhausted. And I went back into depression. I hadn't had a chance to really grieve my father's death because I had been so busy as a caretaker and also a caregiver and trying to also have to make so many decisions for them. It was very, very difficult. And it just became a point where, again, all of the factors aligned that allowed for me to have a third bout with depression. And once again, here we go. It's about 4 to 5 months before Steve felt like Steve again. I've been very fortunate that for the last 5 years, whereas I still have days, and every day I have to manage it with my medication, I've managed to be able to have a fairly rich, full, and happy life. But I want to make a few suggestions to you about this before I leave you. Number one, when it comes to depression, these are some important keys to understand. I've detailed from my own story what some of the warning signs are. Here are some of the keys that you need to know. Number one, if you're diagnosed with depression, immediately be referred to a doctor who's competent and who has a specialty in dealing with this. Your family doctor first, and if your family doctor feels like you need to be referred to someone else, particularly a counselor, do it. And don't be ashamed of it. That's number two. Do not be ashamed, do not be embarrassed at a diagnosis of depression or any kind of mental illness. Because I've got news for you. If you had a physical illness, you got to get somebody to help you get well, somebody who's a competent professional. Okay? So you have a mental or emotional illness. It's just a different part of your body working here. So in short, get the help you need. It's so important with that. Number three, if you're prescribed medication, take it. Don't make your own decisions to lay it off. But if you start having side effects, call your doctor. Don't just say, I'm not messing with that. Call your doctor. Let your doctor work with you, because when it comes to the kind of medications that are effective in dealing with depression, you got to remember there's 60 different grades or levels of depression. And that means it's not one size fits all. There are many different kinds of medications that work for one person's depression, but they may not for another one. I know you see all the commercials on television saying, ask your doctor if whatever it is right for you. Well, in this case, you really have to, because, and don't just buy into those advertisements, because they're designed to get you to buy their medication. That might not be right for you in a given situation. But let your doctor do some trial and error, because it is so often the case. And it is really in anything that you have as an illness, but particularly with emotional illness. Let your doctor have the time and have the patience with it. And that's my fourth and final thing. Have patience. There's not many of us who are made in the mold of Job. But I got news for you. You better learn patience if you have depression, because it is not going to be a road that you come to an end with in about 2 or 3 days. No. It's probably going to be weeks or months before you really feel like that all of the things that are coming together to create this portion where the neurotransmitters are not clicking in and where you suddenly find yourself not feeling like you. It's going to take some time. Patience is so important. And I'll add one more thing. Don't pay any attention to anybody who says anything to you out of ignorance, because you got to remember, even though we've gone a long way to eliminating stigma on this, we still have some people who are totally ignorant because they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to deal with it. And you know what I say? Forget about them. The day that they will start getting educated to this, unfortunately, I hope it doesn't happen to them, but the day that somebody like that gets educated is usually when they experience that kind of illness themselves. Just remember, professionals are out there to help you. And my slogan that I use, maybe I'll get this copyrighted one of these days, and I'll probably find out somebody already has. You can't get well if you don't get help. I got news for you. If you had a wisdom tooth, would you try to pull it yourself? I don't think so. If you had to have a root canal, you surely wouldn't do that for yourself. If you had a broken leg, would you try to set it yourself? I don't think so. In short, you got to have help to get well from all of those kinds of situations. So if you are diagnosed with depression, PTSD, anxiety, and sometimes depression and anxiety, they go hand in hand with each other. I still deal with anxiety. Just share you a quick story. It's very hard for me today to get into large crowds where there is huge volume. One of the places that's very difficult for me is right here on this Union University campus, the Grant Center. It's because of the fact the rooms there don't have a lot of windows in them. And it tends to be a darker room. And also then what happens if you get, say, 300 or 400 people in that room and they're all buzzing and there's a lot of conversation, particularly when there's a meet and greet period, that volume level just gets to me. It's part of the anxiety that hangs on when you have depression. So sometimes I just have to get out of there. And I don't care if anybody doesn't like it, or I don't care if people don't understand. I got to do what I got to do so that I can be at peace, that I can have a calm situation. As we say, it's not one size fits all. So in short, do what you got to do. And you got to just keep remembering this. You can't get well if you don't get help. I hope that through all of this is just one man's story, but I hope you've been able to understand that, even people in your walk of life that seem to be just totally the happiest and most well-adjusted people, there may be somebody in your walk of life, either in your family, maybe in your church congregation, maybe where you work, that is dealing with some form of depression but just hasn't been able to bring themselves to get help. Maybe it's you. And I just hope that one man's story and one man's testimony will help you remember this. There's nothing to be ashamed about, and there is nothing to be embarrassed about. It's just a different part of your body than what we conventionally think of are things that make us sick. And when you're sick, you got to do what it takes to get well. I hope to be able to come back with you and just have a question and answer one-on-one dialogue, because I think nothing would please me any more than to be able to have that kind of conversation with you. But I hope all of you have a wonderful day the rest of the day, and I hope to see all of you sometime in the near future. And until I'm with you at some point in the future, this is Steve Beverly saying so long from the great hub city of West Tennessee.